Join Marple the Clue Crafter for Miss Marple's brilliant mystery solutions.
In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a stranger sips tea in Mrs. Bantry's cozy tea shop, his eyes hiding a dangerous secret. When Mr. Julian Trent is found dead in a locked cottage, poisoned by a scone, the village whispers of murder. Who slipped cyanide into the tea room's heart? Why was a cryptic letter signed C hidden in his books? And how did the killer vanish from a bolted room? Join Miss Jane Marple with her sharp mind and little gray cells as she unravels a web of lies, past betrayals, and a deadly truth that will shock St. Mary Mead to its core. Can you spot the clues before she does? Chapter 1: The Tea Shop on Clover Lane. The village of St. Mary Mead, nestled in the gentle folds of the English countryside, was a place where time seemed to pause, as if reluctant to disturb the quiet rhythm of its days. Clover Lane, a narrow thoroughfare lined with ivy-clad cottages and a single, unassuming tea shop, was the heart of this sleepy hamlet. The tea shop, known as Mrs. Bantry's Tea Room, was a quaint establishment with lace curtains, polished oak tables, and a reputation for the finest scones in the county. It was here, on a crisp October afternoon in 1935, that the seeds of a most perplexing mystery were sown. Miss Jane Marple, a spinster of advancing years but undiminished sharpness, sat at her usual corner table by the window. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, producing a lacy shawl that seemed to grow with the same precision as her observations. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly lady enjoying her tea, her soft white hair tucked neatly under a modest hat, her blue eyes twinkling behind spectacles. But those who knew her understood that Miss Marple's mind was as keen as a blade, slicing through the veneer of human behavior to reveal the truths beneath. The tea shop was abuzz with its usual clientele: villagers exchanging gossip, travelers pausing for refreshment, and the occasional stranger whose presence stirred mild curiosity. At a table near the counter sat Mrs. Clara Henshaw, the vicar's wife, her plump hands fussing over a teapot as she chatted with Mrs. Lucy Dane, the local schoolmistress. Their conversation, though animated, was punctuated by polite smiles, as if each was wary of revealing too much. At another table, young Dr. Richard Hayworth, the village's new physician, sat alone, his brow furrowed over a medical journal. His arrival 3 months prior had caused a flutter among the village's eligible ladies, though his reserved demeanor had kept most at bay. Across the room, Mr. Lionel Green tea and scones with practiced efficiency. Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn to a newcomer seated near the fireplace. Mr. Julian Trent, a man of perhaps 40, had arrived in St. Mary Mead only a week ago, taking up residence at Clover Cottage. He was a handsome figure, with dark hair slicked back and a mustache that spoke of meticulous grooming. His tailored suit and polished shoes suggested wealth, yet his eyes held a restless quality, as if he were perpetually expecting an interruption. He sipped his tea with a studied calm, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand as he set the cup down. The clock above the counter struck 4, its chimes mingling with the murmur of conversation. Miss Marple's needles paused as she observed a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Mrs. Henshaw's voice grew sharper. Her words clipped as she spoke of a recent theft at the vicarage, a silver candlestick, of all things, taken from the altar. Mrs. Dane nodded sympathetically, but her eyes flicked toward Dr. Hayworth, who seemed oblivious to the discussion. Mr. Greaves, meanwhile, launched into a loud opinion on the matter, declaring that such pilfering is the work of outsiders. Mark my words. Miss Carver, pale as ever, excused herself and stepped outside, her movements hurried. Miss Marple's gaze returned to Mr. Trent, who was now staring at a small notebook in his lap. He scribbled something, then tore out the page, folding it carefully before slipping it into his pocket. The act was innocuous enough, yet Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing the small betrayals of human nature, stirred. There was something deliberate in his manner, something that suggested a man with a purpose he did not wish to share. As the afternoon waned, the tea shop began to empty. Mrs. Henshaw and Mrs. Dane departed, their conversation trailing off into the crisp air. Dr. Hayworth closed his journal and left without a word, his expression preoccupied. Mr. Greaves lingered, regaling Mrs. Bantry with tales of his legal triumphs, while Miss Carver returned, her cheeks flushed as if from a brisk walk. Mr. Trent, however, remained, his eyes fixed on the fire, the notebook now closed on the table before him. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloging the details of the scene. The tea shop, with its cozy familiarity, was a microcosm of St. Mary Mead, a place where secrets simmered beneath the surface of civility. She had seen such settings before: quiet villages, grand estates, even a train carriage, where the ordinary concealed the extraordinary. And though she could not yet name the shadow that hung over Mrs. Bantry's tea room, she felt its presence as surely as she felt the weight of her knitting in her lap. Mrs. Bantry, his voice low but urgent. Miss Marple's ears, sharper than her age might suggest, caught fragments of their conversation. Urgent matter, vicarage, not just the candlestick. Mrs. Bantry's face tightened, and she gestured toward the back room, where the two disappeared. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles moving with steady precision. The tea shop, she mused, was a stage, and its players were assembling for a drama yet to unfold. She did not know what role she would play, but she was certain of one thing: in St. Mary Mead, as in life, nothing was ever quite as it seemed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Clover Lane, Miss Marple gathered her things and stepped into the evening chill. The tea shop's warmth lingered in her mind, but so too did the faint, unmistakable scent of trouble. She would return tomorrow, she decided, for there was work to be done. Work that required not a badge or a gun, but the quiet, relentless logic of her little gray cells. Chapter 2. The Shadow of a Crime. The morning sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the mist that clung to the hedgerows along Clover Lane. Mrs. Bantry's tea room, however, was steeped in an air of unease that no amount of sunlight could dispel. The previous evening's whispered conversation between Inspector Craddock and Mrs. Bantry had spread through the village like wildfire, igniting whispers of a crime more serious than a stolen candlestick. By the time Miss Jane Marple arrived at the tea shop shortly after 10, the atmosphere was thick with speculation. Miss Marple settled into her usual corner, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes scanning the room with the calm precision of a seasoned observer. The tea shop was quieter than usual, its tables sparsely occupied. Mrs. Bantry stood behind the counter, her face pale and her movements brisker than necessary, as she polished an already gleaming teapot. Mr. Lionel Greaves was absent, a notable omission given his penchant for morning tea and gossip. Miss Evelyn Carver sat alone, her fingers twisting a handkerchief, her eyes red-rimmed as if from sleeplessness. Dr. Richard Hayworth was present, but his medical journal lay unopened, his attention fixed on the window as if expecting someone. At a table near the door, Mrs. Clara Henshaw and Mrs. Lucy Dane huddled together, their voices low but urgent. Miss Marple caught snatches of their conversation. "Dreadful business. Found this morning. Poor soul." The words, though fragmented, were enough to confirm her suspicions. Something had happened, something grave. The bell above the door chimed, and Inspector Craddock entered, his expression grim. He was accompanied by Constable Harris, a young man whose nerve respected her insight. He often underestimated the depth of her understanding. To him, she was a kindly old lady with a knack for noticing details, a useful ally, but not the mastermind she truly was. Craddock approached Mrs. Bantry, who gestured toward the back room. The two disappeared, leaving Constable Harris to stand awkwardly by the door, his notebook clutched tightly. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she pieced together the morning's clues. The absence of Mr. Greaves, the strained faces of the tea shop's patrons, and the inspector's presence all pointed to a single conclusion. A crime had occurred, and it was no mere theft. Her suspicions were confirmed when Mrs. Bantry emerged, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She approached Miss Marple's table, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Marple, it's terrible. Mr. Trent, Mr. Julian Trent, he's dead. Found this morning in Clover Cottage, not half an hour ago." Miss Marple's needles paused, her face betraying no surprise, though her mind raced. "Dead, you say? How dreadful. Was it an accident?" Mrs. Bantry shook her head, her lips trembling. "No accident, I'm afraid. Inspector Craddock says it's murder. Poison, they think. Oh, Miss Marple, in our little village." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on Mrs. Bantry's arm, her voice gentle but firm. There, my dear. Tell me what you know, if you please. Every detail matters." Mrs. Bantry recounted what little she had gleaned. Mr. Trent had been found in his sitting room, slumped in an armchair, a glass of brandy on the table beside him. The room was locked from the inside, the windows secure, and there was no sign of a struggle. A small vial, empty but for a faint residue, had been found in the fireplace, its contents suspected to be the poison that ended his life. The discovery had been made by Mrs. Henshaw, who had called at Clover Cottage to deliver a parish newsletter and found the door ajar. Miss Marple listened intently, her mind cataloging each detail. A locked room, a poison vial, a man who had arrived in St. Mary Mead only a week ago. There was a puzzle here, one that demanded her full attention. She thanked Mrs. Bantry and resumed her knitting, her eyes drifting to the other patrons. Miss Carver's hands trembled as she sipped her tea, her gaze fixed on the table. Dr. Hayworth, meanwhile, had risen to speak with Constable Harris, his voice low but insistent, as if offering his professional opinion. The tea shop's door opened again, admitting Mr. Greaves, whose florid waistcoat seemed at odds with his ashen face. He nodded curtly to Miss Marple before joining Mrs. Henshaw and Mrs. Dane, who greeted him with hushed urgency. Miss Marple noted the time, 10:47 a.m., and the fact that Mr. Greaves's Marple's thoughts turned to Mr. Trent. A man of mystery, his brief tenure in St. Mary Mead had been marked by reserve and a certain guardedness. She recalled the notebook he had been writing in the previous day, the folded page he had pocketed with such care. Had it contained a clue to his fate? And what of the locked room? Poison suggested premeditation, intimacy even, a crime of calculation rather than impulse. As the morning progressed, Inspector Craddock emerged and began questioning the patrons. He spoke first to Mrs. Henshaw, who recounted her discovery of the body with a mixture of horror and self-importance. She had arrived at Clover Cottage at 9:15 a.m., she said, and found the door slightly open. Assuming Mr. Trent was expecting her, she had entered, only to find him dead. She had touched nothing, she insisted, and had run straight to fetch the constable. Mrs. Dane, questioned next, confirmed she had seen Mr. Trent the previous evening, leaving the tea shop around 6, He had seemed preoccupied, she said, but otherwise in good health. Dr. Hayworth offered that he had never treated Mr. Trent, but had noticed him in the tea shop, always alone, always watchful. Miss Carver, when questioned, grew pale and stammered that she barely knew the man, though her nervous hands suggested otherwise. Mr. Greaves, for his part, claimed to have been at home all evening, a statement Constable Harris noted with a skeptical frown. Miss Marple listened, her knitting a steady rhythm beneath her thoughts. Each alibi, each gesture, each hesitation was a thread in the tapestry of the crime. She noted the times provided: Mrs. Henshaw's arrival at 9:15, Mr. Trent's departure at 6, and the fact that no one admitted to seeing him after that. The poison, she mused, must have been administered sometime in the evening, but how? And by whom? As Craddock continued his inquiries, Miss Marple's gaze settled on the tea shop's counter, where a tray of scones sat untouched. Mrs. Bantry had mentioned that Mr. Trent had taken a scone to Clover Cottage the previous day, a small detail that now seemed significant. Had the poison been in the scone? Or perhaps the brandy? The vial in the fireplace suggested a more deliberate method, but Miss Marple knew better than to assume. The morning wore on, and the tea shop emptied as patrons drifted away, their faces heavy with the weight of the news. Miss Marple remained, her knitting nearly forgotten as she turned the puzzle over in her mind. Mr. Trent's death was no random act. It was a crime born of motive, opportunity, and a secret that someone in St. Mary Mead was desperate to keep hidden. She would need to observe, to listen, to unravel the threads suspected, the first of many clues that would lead her to the truth. For now, she would return to her cottage, where a cup of tea and a quiet hour would allow her to begin piecing together the mystery of the tea shop on Clover Lane. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Miss Marple's Insight. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the cobblestones of Clover Lane. Mrs. Bantry's tea room, though open for business, wore a somber air, its usual chatter replaced by hushed whispers and furtive glances. The news of Mr. Julian Trent's murder had spread, and with it, a creeping unease that settled over the village like a fog. Miss Jane Marple, however, was undeterred. She returned to the tea shop at precisely 2 o'clock, her knitting bag in hand, her mind already at work on the puzzle of the previous night's crime. As she took her seat by the window, Miss Marple unfolded the scrap of paper she had retrieved from beneath Miss Carver's table. It was a torn fragment, no larger than a calling card, with a few hastily scrawled words. "Meet me at 7, urgent." The handwriting was neat but hurried, the ink smudged as if the writer had been interrupted. Miss Marple tucked the note back into her pocket, her eyes scanning the room for signs of its significance. The tea shop was quieter than the morning, with only a handful of patrons present, their faces etched with the strain of the day's events. Mrs. Bantry, still shaken but resolute, bustled about, serving tea with a forced smile. Dr. Richard Hayworth was absent, likely attending to his duties at the village surgery, but Miss Evelyn Carver sat in her usual corner, her hands clasped tightly around a cup that had long gone cold. Mrs. Clara Henshaw and Mrs. Lucy Dane were present, their conversation subdued, their eyes darting toward the door whenever it opened. Mr. Lionel Greaves had returned, his florid waistcoat a stark contrast to his pallor, and he sat alone, stirring his tea with unnecessary vigor. The bell above the door chimed, and Inspector Craddock entered. his notebook in hand and a look of determination on his face. The inspector's presence confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. The investigation was moving swiftly, and Clover Cottage was now the focus of official attention. Craddock nodded to Miss Marple, a gesture that carried both respect and a hint of wariness, before approaching Mrs. Bantry to request the use of the back room once more. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she observed the scene. She had not been invited to Clover Cottage, nor asset. She would wait, she decided, for the moment when her insight would be needed. As Craddock and Dr. Hayworth disappeared into the back room, Miss Marple turned her attention to the other patrons. Miss Carver's nervousness had intensified. Her fingers twisted her handkerchief into knots, and her eyes flicked toward the counter where Mrs. Bantry was arranging a tray of scones. Mrs. Henshaw, meanwhile, leaned toward Mrs. Dane, her voice a low murmur. "They say the poison was in the brandy, but how could it have been administered?" Mrs. Dane shook her head, her expression troubled. "And the locked room, how does one explain that?" Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the details of the crime. A locked room, a vial of poison, a glass of brandy. Each element suggested a crime of precision and forethought. The note in her pocket hinted at a clandestine meeting, one that Mr. Trent may have attended shortly before his death. The time, 7 p.m., aligned with Mrs. Dane's account of seeing him leave the tea shop at 6. Had he gone to Clover Cottage to meet someone, and if so, who? Her reverie was interrupted by the return of Inspector Craddock, who emerged from the back room with a grave expression. He approached Miss Marple's table, his voice low but clear. "Miss Marple, might I have a word? Your perspective has been helpful in the past." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her face serene. "Of course, Inspector, I am at your disposal." Craddock sat opposite her, his notebook open. "I understand you were here yesterday afternoon when Mr. Trent was last seen. Did you notice anything unusual about him? Anything at all?" Miss Marple considered her response carefully, her mind sifting through the details of the previous day. "Mr. Trent was a man of careful habits," she began, her voice soft but precise. "He sat by the fireplace, writing in a notebook. I observed him tear out a page and pocket it with a certain deliberation. He seemed watchful, as if expecting something or someone." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "A notebook, you say? We found no such item at Clover Cottage. Did you see what he wrote?" "No, Inspector, I did not, but I did notice that he left the tea shop shortly after 6, as Mrs. Dane confirmed. And I observed a certain tension in his manner, as if he were guarding a secret." Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful. "Anything else?" Miss Marple were halting and evasive. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind turning over the new information. The absence of the notebook was significant. Either it had been taken, or Mr. Trent had hidden it before his death. And the locked room. How had the poison been administered in a space so secure? As the afternoon progressed, Dr. Hayworth returned, his face drawn. He spoke briefly with Craddock, confirming that the poison was likely cyanide, administered through the brandy. The vial found in the fireplace bore traces of the same substance, suggesting it had been used to deliver the fatal dose. The locked room, however, remained a mystery. The key was found in Mr. Trent's pocket, and the windows showed no signs of tampering. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement from Miss Carver, who rose abruptly and left the tea shop, her scarf trailing behind her. The action was so sudden that it drew the attention of Mrs. Henshaw and Mrs. Dane, who exchanged a glance. Miss Marple noted the time, 2:45 p.m., and the fact that Miss Carver had left her handkerchief on the table, a small detail that might prove significant. As the tea shop emptied, Miss Marple gathered her things and stepped outside, her mind alive with possibilities. The note in her pocket, the missing notebook, the locked room, all were pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. She would visit Clover Cottage, she decided, not as an official investigator, but as a concerned villager. There, she might find the subtle contradictions that would lead her to the truth. The wind carried a chill as she made her way along Clover Lane, her steps measured but purposeful. St. Mary Mead was no stranger to secrets, and Miss Marple knew that beneath its tranquil surface lay a web of motives and desires. She would unravel it, thread by thread, until the truth was laid bare. For now, she would observe, listen, and trust in the quiet power of her little gray cells. Chapter 4. The Threads of Inquiry. The late afternoon light bathed St. Mary Mead in a soft amber glow, but the tranquility of Clover Lane was marred by the somber activity at Clover Cottage. The small, ivy-covered house, once an unremarkable fixture of the village, was now cordoned off by a constable, its windows glinting with an almost accusatory sheen. Miss Jane Marple approached with her characteristic, unhurried gait, her knitting bag slung over one arm, her expression one of polite concern. She had no official business here, but her reputation as a keen observer had earned her a certain latitude with the local police, and she intended to make use of it. Constable Harris, stationed at the cottage's gate, recognized her at once. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap. "I'm afraid the inspectors—" "I only wish to offer my sympathies and see if I might be of any small assistance. A tragedy in our little village affects us all, does it not?" Harris hesitated, then stepped aside, his youthful face betraying a mix of respect and uncertainty. "Just don't touch anything, ma'am. Inspector's orders." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling with a hint of amusement. She stepped into the cottage, where the air was heavy with the scent of furniture polish and something sharper, perhaps the lingering trace of cyanide. The sitting room where Mr. Julian Trent had met his end was modest but tidy, with a single armchair by the fireplace, a small table bearing an empty brandy glass, and a bookshelf lined with volumes that looked untouched. Inspector Craddock stood near the window, conferring with Dr. Hayworth, who was examining the vial found in the fireplace. "Ah, Miss Marple," Craddock said, his tone a blend of surprise and resignation. "I might have known you'd find your way here. Care to share your thoughts?" Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail with the precision of a cartographer mapping uncharted territory. "A most curious scene, Inspector," she said softly. "A locked room, a single glass, a vial of poison. Yet no sign of the notebook Mr. Trent was so careful with yesterday. Have you found it, may I ask?" Craddock shook his head, his brow furrowing. "No notebook, I'm afraid. We've searched the cottage thoroughly. If it was here, it's gone now." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the scrap of paper in her pocket. The note, "Meet me at 7, urgent," suggested a rendezvous, perhaps one that had led Mr. Trent to his death. She chose not to mention it yet, preferring to gather more threads before weaving them into a pattern. Instead, she approached the fireplace, where the vial lay on a cloth, its glass scorched but intact. "This vial," she said, "was it empty when found?" Dr. Hayworth glanced up, his expression guarded. "Nearly so. A faint residue of cyanide, as I confirmed, likely poured into the brandy, though how it was done without arousing suspicion is beyond me." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the brandy glass, its rim clean but for a slight smudge. "And the glass, only Mr. Trent's fingerprints, I presume?" Craddock nodded. "Just his. No sign of anyone else in the room either. The door was locked, the key in his pocket, and the windows bolted from the inside. It's a proper puzzle, Miss Marple." "Indeed," she murmured, her mind racing. A locked room suggested either an extraordinary method or an overlooked detail, and Miss Marple was inclined to favor the latter. She noted the position of the armchair, angled toward the fireplace, and the small table. Miss Marple returned to the tea shop, where the afternoon crowd was thin but tense. Mrs. Bantry was wiping down tables with unnecessary vigor, while Mrs. Clara Henshaw and Mrs. Lucy Dane sat in their usual corner, their conversation stilted. Miss Evelyn Carver was absent, a fact that piqued Miss Marple's interest, given her nervous demeanor earlier. Mr. Lionel Greaves, however, was present, his florid waistcoat a beacon of color in the subdued room. He was speaking to a newcomer, a wiry man with sharp features and a restless manner, introduced as Mr. Arthur Poole, a traveling salesman who had arrived in St. Mary Mead that morning. Miss Marple took her seat, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm as she listened to the undercurrents of conversation. Mr. Greaves was regaling Mr. Poole with tales of the village, his voice loud but strained, as if masking unease. "A quiet place, St. Mary Mead," he said, "until this dreadful business with Trent. Never thought we'd see murder here." Mr. Poole nodded, his eyes darting around the room. "Terrible thing, murder. Makes one wonder who'd have reason to do such a thing." Miss Marple's needles paused as she caught a flicker of something in Mr. Poole's tone, a curiosity that seemed more than casual. She made a mental note to inquire about his arrival, for strangers in St. Mary Mead were rare, and their timing often significant. As the afternoon waned, Inspector Craddock entered the tea shop, his notebook now bulging with notes. He approached Miss Marple, his expression one of cautious trust. "I've spoken to everyone who was here yesterday," he said. "Mrs. Henshaw claims she saw nothing unusual, though she was the last to leave the tea shop at 6:30. Mrs. Dane confirms Trent left around 6, as you noted. Miss Carver says she went straight home after leaving here, and Mr. Greaves insists he was at his cottage all evening, alone. Dr. Hayworth was at the surgery until late, which his nurse confirms." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the alibis. "And their reasons for disliking Mr. Trent, Inspector? For surely a man so new to the village must have stirred some resentment." Craddock hesitated, then leaned closer. "Mrs. Henshaw mentioned a disagreement with Trent over a donation to the church, something about him refusing to contribute. Mrs. Dane said he was asking odd questions about the village, almost as if he were investigating someone. Miss Carver barely spoke of him, but she seemed frightened. And Greaves, well, he claims Trent was a sly sort, though he wouldn't elaborate." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "How very interesting. And Dr. Hayworth? He says he hardly knew the man, though he admitted to noticing Trent's interest in the tea shop. Had he met someone at Clover Cottage? And if so, how had the poison been administered in a locked room? The scone, the brandy, the vial, all were pieces of a puzzle that refused to align. As Craddock moved to question Mr. Poole, Miss Marple observed the salesman's reaction. His smile was quick, his answers glib, but his hands betrayed a nervous energy, tapping the table in a rhythm that matched her knitting. She made a note to learn more about Mr. Poole, for his arrival on the day of the murder's discovery was a coincidence she did not trust. The tea shop closed early, its patrons dispersing into the gathering dusk. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the counter where Mrs. Bantry was stacking teacups. The scone, she thought, was a detail too easily overlooked. Had it been poisoned, or was it merely a distraction? And what of the notebook, missing from the cottage? She would need to speak with Miss Carver, whose nervousness suggested a secret, and perhaps Mr. Greaves, whose bluster masked something deeper. As she stepped into the cool evening air, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery pressing upon her. The threads were there, waiting to be woven into a coherent pattern. She would return to the tea shop tomorrow, she decided, for it was in the ordinary moments of village life that the truth often revealed itself. With a quiet resolve, she made her way home, her mind alive with the subtle contradictions that would lead her to the heart of the crime. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a delicate veil, softening the edges of Clover Lane as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Mrs. Bantry's tea room. The village, though outwardly serene, thrummed with the undercurrent of unease that follows a murder. The tea shop, once a haven of warmth and chatter, now bore the weight of suspicion, its patrons casting sidelong glances as if each harbored a secret. Miss Marple, her knitting bag in hand, took her usual seat by the window, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, her mind already sifting through the tangled threads of the case. The tea shop was busier than the previous day, as if curiosity had drawn the villagers to the heart of the mystery. Mrs. Clara Henshaw and Mrs. Lucy Dane sat in their usual corner, their conversation a low hum punctuated by furtive glances. Mr. Lionel Greaves, his waistcoat as florid as ever, held court at a central table, his voice carrying a forced joviality that did little to mask his unease. Miss Evelyn Carver was absent. Constable Harris, whose nervous energy seemed to have intensified. Craddock's eyes met Miss Marple's, and he offered a nod before approaching Mr. Greaves, whose loud greeting did little to conceal the tension in his posture. The inspector's questions were direct, focusing on Mr. Greaves's whereabouts on the evening of Mr. Trent's death, and Miss Marple listened intently, her knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm. Mr. Greaves, with a flourish of his handkerchief, insisted he had been at home, alone, reading by the fire. "Not a soul to disturb me," he declared, though his eyes darted toward Mrs. Henshaw, who looked away. Miss Marple noted the discrepancy. Mrs. Henshaw had mentioned seeing Mr. Greaves near Clover Lane around 7, a detail she had shared with Mrs. Dane, but not with the inspector. It was a small contradiction, but in Miss Marple's experience, such inconsistencies were the threads that unraveled a lie. As Craddock moved to question Mrs. Henshaw, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the scrap of paper in her pocket with its cryptic message, "Meet me at 7 urgent." The time aligned with Mrs. Henshaw's sighting of Mr. Greaves, suggesting a possible connection. Had Mr. Greaves met Mr. Trent at Clover Cottage? And if so, why had he lied about his whereabouts? The locked room, the poison, the missing notebook, all pointed to a crime of careful planning, and Miss Marple suspected that Mr. Greaves's bluster was a facade to conceal a deeper motive. Her musings were interrupted by a commotion at the counter, where Mrs. Bantry dropped a teacup, the porcelain shattering on the floor. "Oh dear," she exclaimed, her face flushed. "I'm all thumbs today, what with this dreadful business." Mr. Poole, ever the gentleman, rushed to help, his nimble fingers gathering the shards with a speed that caught Miss Marple's eye. There was something practiced in his movements, as if he were accustomed to tidying up messes, literal or otherwise. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Dr. Hayworth, who had risen to assist Mrs. Bantry. His manner was solicitous, but his eyes lingered on the counter, where a tray of scones sat untouched. Miss Marple recalled that Mr. Trent had taken a scone from the tea shop on the evening of his death, a detail that seemed innocuous, but nagged at her. Marple's needles paused as she considered this. Miss Carver's absence today, coupled with her nervous demeanor and the scrap of paper found near her table, suggested she was more involved than she let on. The note's urgency, "Meet me at 7, implied a secret meeting, perhaps one that had led to Mr. Trent's death. Had Miss Carver written the note, or was she its intended recipient? And what of Mr. Poole, whose timely arrival in St. Mary Mead seemed too convenient to be coincidence? Craddock, finishing his round of questions, approached Miss Marple's table, his expression one of guarded respect. "You've been quiet today, Miss Marple," he said, sitting opposite her, "but I know that mind of yours is working. Care to share what you've noticed?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Only that people are rarely as transparent as they believe, Inspector. Take Mr. Greaves, for instance. His alibi is convenient. Yet Mrs. Henshaw places him near Clover Lane at the very time Mr. Trent may have met his end. And Miss Carver, her absence today is telling, don't you think?" Craddock's brow furrowed. "You think Greaves is lying? And what about Miss Carver?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that everyone has a reason to hide something. Mr. Trent was a man who asked questions, and questions can be dangerous. As for Miss Carver, I suspect she knows more than she has admitted. Perhaps you might ask her where she was at 7 o'clock on the evening of the murder." Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful. "You're suggesting she met Trent? But the room was locked, the key in his pocket. How could anyone have entered?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "That, Inspector, is the question. But I have found that the simplest explanation is often the most elusive. A locked room is not always what it seems." As Craddock rose to continue his inquiries, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Mr. Poole, who was now engaged in a lively conversation with Mr. Greaves. The salesman's smile was disarming, but his eyes held a sharpness that Miss Marple recognized, a predator's watchfulness cloaked in charm. She made a mental note to inquire about his business in St. Mary Mead, for his presence was a thread that did not yet fit the pattern. The tea shop began to empty as noon approached, its patrons dispersing with murmured farewells. Miss Marple lingered, her knitting nearly forgotten as she turned over the clues in her mind. The scone, the brandy, the vial, the note, all were red herrings, designed to mislead the unwary. But Miss Marple was not unwary. She knew that the truth lay in the contradictions, the small details that others overlooked. She would visit Miss Carver, she decided, and perhaps Mr. Greaves as well, for their secrets were the key to unlocking the mystery. As she gathered her things and stepped into the crisp autumn air, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill. Murder of Mr. Julian Trent was a puzzle of exquisite complexity, but she was confident that her little gray cells would find the solution. For now she would observe, listen, and follow the threads wherever they led, certain that the truth was waiting to be revealed. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden hue across the rooftops and lending Clover Lane an almost deceptive air of peace. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the chill that crept into the October air, made her way to the modest cottage where Miss Evelyn Carver resided. The young woman's absence from the tea shop that morning, coupled with her nervous demeanor and the mysterious note found near her table, had piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. If there was a thread to be pulled in this tangled web of deceit, Miss Carver, she suspected, might hold its end. The cottage, a small affair with a neatly tended garden, stood at the edge of the village, its windows curtained against prying eyes. Miss Marple knocked gently, her knitting bag slung over her arm, her expression one of benign concern. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing Miss Carver's pale face, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Oh, Miss Marple," she stammered, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. I wasn't expecting visitors." "My dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm, "I only wish to see how you are faring. This dreadful business with Mr. Trent has unsettled us all, has it not?" Miss Carver hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing Miss Marple to enter. The sitting room was sparsely furnished, with a single armchair by a low fire and a small table cluttered with embroidery threads. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender, but there was an undercurrent of tension, as if the room itself held its breath. Miss Marple took a seat, her knitting needles emerging with their familiar click, a sound that seemed to ease the silence. "I understand you were at the tea shop yesterday," Miss Marple began, her eyes gentle but piercing. "You left rather suddenly, I believe, after Mr. Trent's departure. May I ask where you went?" Miss Carver's hands trembled, and she sank into the armchair, her gaze fixed on the fire. I went for a walk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I needed air. The tea shop felt stifling." Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving steadily. "Quite understandable, my dear. But I couldn't help noticing a scrap of paper near your table, a note, perhaps. It seemed to suggest a meeting at 7 o'clock. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Miss Carver's face drained of what little color it held, and her hands clutched the handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. "A note? Mary Mead, small things. A word, a glance, a piece of paper, can tell a story. Mr. Trent, I believe, was a man who asked questions, and questions can make people uneasy. Did he ever ask you anything personal?" Miss Carver's lips parted, but no sound came. After a moment, she shook her head, her voice trembling. "He was polite, but distant. He asked about my family once, about my late father. I thought it odd, but I told him little. My father died years ago in London. There was nothing to tell." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the detail. A question about Miss Carver's father, a man long dead, suggested that Mr. Trent had been searching for something specific, a connection, perhaps, to his own mysterious purpose in St. Mary Mead. She filed the information away, her thoughts returning to the note in her pocket. Its urgency, "Meet me at 7, urgent," implied a meeting that could have taken place at Clover Cottage, where Mr. Trent had met his end. Leaving Miss Carver's cottage, Miss Marple made her way back to Clover Lane, her steps measured but purposeful. The tea shop was closed for the afternoon, but she paused outside Clover Cottage, where Constable Harris still stood guard. She offered him a polite smile, then turned her attention to the cottage's exterior. The windows, she noted, were indeed bolted, and the door showed no signs of tampering. Yet something caught her eye, a faint smudge on the window pane nearest the door. as if a hand had pressed against it. It was a small detail, but in Miss Marple's experience, such details were often the key to unlocking a mystery. Returning to her own cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire. Her knitting resumed as she turned over the day's discoveries. The note, Miss Carver's evasiveness, the smudge on the window, all were clues, but they were not yet a pattern. She thought of Mr. Trent's notebook, still missing, and the vial of cyanide in the fireplace. The poison, Dr. Hayworth had confirmed, had been in the brandy, but how had it been administered in a locked room? And why had Mr. Trent, a man so cautious, allowed himself to be poisoned? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Bantry, her face flushed with excitement. "Miss Marple, you'll never believe it," she said, stepping inside. "They found something at Clover Cottage, a letter tucked inside a book on the shelf. It's addressed to Mr. Trent, and it's from someone in London. Inspector Craddock's in a tizzy about it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A letter, you say? How very interesting. Did you happen to see what it said?" Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "Only a glimpse. Something about settling an old debt and the truth must stay buried. It was signed with just an initial C. Oh, Miss Marple, do you think it's a clue?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her voice calm, "that it is a thread, and threads, when woven together, form a tapestry. Thank you, Mrs. Bantry. You've been most helpful." As Mrs. Bantry departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind racing. A letter from London, signed with a C. Could it be Miss Carver? Or perhaps Mrs. Clara Henshaw? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone not yet in the frame? The mention of an old debt suggested a motive rooted in the past, a secret Mr. Trent had come to St. Mary Mead to uncover, and the smudge on the window. Had someone entered the cottage after all? Perhaps not through the door, but through a more subtle means. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the tea shop, where the scone Mr. Trent had taken remained a nagging detail. She recalled Mrs. Bantry's tray of scones, untouched on the day of the murder's discovery, and the way Mr. Poole had so deftly cleaned up the broken teacup. His arrival in the village, so conveniently timed, was another thread that did not yet fit. And Mr. Greaves, with his shaky alibi, and Mrs. Henshaw's sighting near Clover Lane, what was he hiding? As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's needles moved with quiet precision, mirroring the steady work of her mind. The clue in the letter, the smudge on the window, the note in her pocket, all were pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. She would need to speak with Mr. Greaves, she decided, and perhaps revisit Clover Cottage to examine the window more closely. For now, she would let the threads settle, trusting that the truth, like her knitting, would emerge from patience and care. The evening closed in, the village settling into a restless silence. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her eyes on the flames, her mind weaving the details into a pattern only she could see. The murder of Mr. Julian Trent was no random act. It was a crime of calculation, and somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the killer was waiting, unaware that Miss Marple's little gray cells were already closing in. More lies surface. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp bite, as if the village itself were bracing for the revelations that seemed to loom ever closer. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, walked purposefully along Clover Lane, her destination the cottage of Mr. Lionel Greaves. The retired solicitor's shaky alibi and Mrs. Henshaw's sighting of him near Clover Cottage on the evening of Mr. Trent's murder had stirred Miss Marple's suspicions. If there was a crack in the facade of this mystery, she was determined to find it. Mr. Greaves's cottage, a sturdy affair with a manicured lawn and a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, stood at the far end of the lane. Miss Marple knocked, her expression one of polite passing by, Mr. Greaves, she replied, her voice gentle but laced with purpose. And thought I might inquire after your health. This dreadful business with Mr. Trent has been a shock to us all, has it not? Mr. Greaves ushered her inside, his movements stiff. The sitting room was cluttered with legal tomes and papers, a testament to his former profession, though the air held a faint staleness, as if the windows were rarely opened. He offered her a chair, his hands fidgeting with a pen as he sat opposite. Dreadful indeed, he said, his voice carrying a practiced bluster. A man like Trent, coming to our quiet village and meeting such an end. Shocking. Miss Marple's needles emerged, their steady click a counterpoint to the tension in the room. Quite so, she said. I understand you were at home on the evening of his death, reading by the fire. A most comforting routine, I'm sure, though I believe Mrs. Henshaw mentioned seeing you near Clover Lane around 7. A curious discrepancy, wouldn't you say? Mr. Greaves's face reddened, and he coughed, reaching for a glass of water. Mrs. Henshaw must be mistaken, he said, his tone defensive. I was here, as I told the inspector. People see what they want to see, Miss Marple. Especially in times like these. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving his. Of course. But you see, Mr. Greaves, small details matter. A man like Mr. Trent, so new to St. Mary Mead, must have had a reason for being here. Did he ever speak to you of his business? Perhaps something about an old debt, or a matter from the past. The question struck a nerve, for Mr. Greaves's hands stilled, and his eyes darted to a stack of papers on the table. He was a nosy sort, he said, his voice low. Asked me about my time in London years ago when I practiced law. Said he was tracing a case from the war, some nonsense about a missing will. I told him I'd retired and had no interest in digging up old matters. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the mention of a will. The letter found at Clover Cottage, signed with a C and referencing an old debt, hinted at a motive rooted in the past. Could Mr. Greaves's legal career be connected to Mr. Trent's inquiries? And if so, why had he lied about his whereabouts? Leaving the cottage, Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Bantry's tea room, where the afternoon crowd was gathering. The tea shop, though still subdued, buzzed with the low hum of gossip, and Miss Marple took her usual seat by the window, her knitting resuming its rhythm. Mrs. Clara Henshaw and Mrs. Lucy Dane were present, their conversation halting as they noticed her arrival. Miss Evelyn Carver had returned, her face pale and her hands clasped. Attention was drawn to Miss Carver, whose nervous glances suggested a secret she could no longer contain. As Mrs. Bantry served a tray of scones, Miss Marple noted a curious detail. The tray was identical to the one from which Mr. Trent had taken a scone on the evening of his death. She recalled the partially eaten scone found at Clover Cottage, a detail that had seemed insignificant but now gnawed at her. Had the scone been poisoned, or was it merely a distraction? Inspector Craddock entered, his notebook in hand, his face etched with the strain of a case that refused to yield. He approached Miss Marple's table, his voice low. Miss Marple, we've had a development. Miss Carver came to the station this morning, claiming she saw Mr. Trent arguing with someone outside the tea shop around 6:30 on the evening he died. She wouldn't say who, only that it was a heated exchange. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. How very interesting, Inspector. And did she say where she was at 7 o'clock? Craddock shook his head. She claims she went home after her walk, but she was vague on the details. I'm beginning to think she's hiding something. Indeed, Miss Marple said softly. People often hide what they fear to reveal. Have you considered the letter found at Clover Cottage? The mention of an old debt and a signature, C, might point to someone in this very room. Craddock's brow furrowed. You think Miss Carver wrote it? I think, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking, that the letter is a thread, and threads lead to patterns. You might ask Mr. Greaves about his time in London, Inspector. He mentioned a case involving a missing will. Perhaps it connects to Mr. Trent's inquiries. Craddock nodded, making a note. As he moved to question Miss Carver, Miss Marple observed the young woman's reaction. Her hands trembled and her eyes darted toward the door, as if she longed to flee. The sight confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Miss Carver was entangled in the mystery. Perhaps not as the killer, but as someone who knew more than she dared admit. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Mr. Poole, whose polished charm and timely arrival continued to intrigue her. She approached the counter, where he was helping Mrs. Bantry arrange a display of pastries. Mr. Poole, she said, her voice warm, you've settled into St. Mary Mead quite quickly. May I ask what brings you to our little village? Poole's smile was quick, but his eyes held a flicker of caution. Just passing through, Miss Marple, he said. I sell stationery, notebooks, pens, that sort of thing. Thought to him and returned to her seat, her knitting a steady rhythm as she pieced together the clues. The tea shop began to empty as evening approached, its patrons dispersing into the gathering dusk. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on Miss Carver, who rose abruptly and left, her scarf trailing behind her. The action echoed her sudden departure on the day of the murder, and Miss Marple made a note to follow up. The lies were surfacing, she thought. Mr. Greaves's alibi, Miss Carver's evasions, Mr. Poole's convenient arrival. Each was a thread, and the tapestry was beginning to take shape. As she stepped into the cool evening air, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery pressing upon her. The letter, the scone, the smudge on the window, all were clues, but the truth lay in their connections. She would need to speak with Miss Carver again, and perhaps examine the letter found at Clover Cottage. For now, she would trust in the quiet power of her little gray cells, certain that the truth was closer than anyone suspected. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The morning mist had burned away, leaving St. Mary Mead bathed in the pale sunlight of late October. Clover Lane, with its quaint cottages and the ever-present hum of village life, seemed almost to hold its breath, as if aware that the mystery of Mr. Julian Trent's murder was nearing a critical juncture. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a constant companion, made her way to Mrs. Bantry's tea room, her mind alive with the threads she had gathered, the note, the missing notebook, the letter signed C, and the smudge on Clover Cottage's window. Today, she sensed, would bring a revelation, for the weight of secrets was becoming too heavy for someone to bear. The tea shop was quieter than usual, its tables sparsely occupied, as if the villagers sensed the storm brewing beneath the surface. Mrs. Clara Henshaw and Mrs. Lucy Dane sat in their usual corner, their conversation subdued, their eyes flickering with unease. Mr. Lionel Greaves was absent, a notable omission given his penchant for holding court, while Dr. Richard Hayworth sat alone, his medical journal closed, his fingers drumming restlessly on the table. Mr. Arthur Poole, the traveling salesman, was present, his sharp features softened by a practiced smile as he chatted with Mrs. Bantry at the counter. but it was Miss Evelyn Carver who drew Miss Marple's attention, her pale face etched with a distress that bordered on desperation. Miss Marple took her seat by the window, her knitting needles emerging with their familiar click. She observed Miss Carver closely, noting the young woman's trembling hands and the way her eyes darted toward the door was hiding something, perhaps a truth that could no longer be contained. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, Inspector Craddock entered, his face drawn with the strain of a case that refused to yield. He approached her table, his notebook in hand, his expression one of cautious respect. "Miss Marple," he said, sitting opposite her, "I've followed your advice and looked into Mr. Greaves's past. It seems he was involved in a case in London years ago, a disputed will that caused quite a scandal. The details are vague, but Mr. Trent's inquiries about a missing will seem to point in that direction." Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving steadily. "How very interesting, Inspector. And the letter found at Clover Cottage. Have you learned more about this C who wrote of an old debt?" Craddock's brow furrowed. "Not yet, but we're tracing its origins. It was posted from London a week before Trent arrived in St. Mary Mead. The handwriting doesn't match Miss Carver's, but she's been uncooperative. She insists she barely knew Trent, but I'm certain she's hiding something." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "People often hide what they fear, Inspector. Miss Carver's manner suggests a burden she cannot carry much longer. Perhaps a gentle word might encourage her to speak." Craddock nodded, making a note, then rose to approach Miss Carver. Miss Marple watched as he spoke to her, his voice low but firm. Miss Carver's response was halting, her hands clutching her teacup as if it were an anchor. Suddenly, her composure broke, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The tea shop fell silent, all eyes turning to the young woman whose distress was now impossible to ignore. Mrs. Bantry hurried over, her face a mixture of concern and alarm. "Evelyn, dear, whatever is the matter?" she asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. Miss Carver's voice was choked with emotion. I can't keep it in any longer," she whispered. "Mr. Trent, he knew something about my father. He came to me that evening, before it happened. He said he had proof that my father's death wasn't an accident, that someone had caused it. He wanted my help, but I was afraid. I told him to leave me alone." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "When was this, Miss Carver, and where?" "At the tea shop," she said, her voice trembling. "Just before 6. He was so insistent, almost desperate. I left soon after, but I saw him later, near Clover Cottage, arguing with someone. I didn't see who, it was too dark, but I heard Ray's involvement in a disputed will. All pointed to a motive rooted in history." But the argument Miss Carver had witnessed, who had been with Mr. Trent at Clover Cottage, and how had they entered a locked room? Craddock pressed Miss Carver for more details, but she shook her head, her tears falling freely. "I don't know who it was," she insisted. "I only heard voices. A man's, I think. But I couldn't be sure. I swear I didn't see anything more." As Craddock jotted notes, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Mr. Poole, who had been watching the scene with an intensity that belied his casual demeanor. His hands, she noted, were still, but his eyes held a calculating glint, as if assessing the impact of Miss Carver's words. Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire further about his business in St. Mary Mead, for his presence remained a thread that did not yet fit the pattern. The tea shop began to empty as the afternoon waned, its patrons murmuring about Miss Carver's outburst. Mrs. Henshaw and Mrs. Dane exchanged knowing glances, their conversation turning to speculation about Mr. Trent's motives. Dr. Hayworth, who had remained silent, rose to leave, his expression troubled. Miss Marple noted the time, 2:15 p.m., and the fact that Mr. Greaves's absence was now conspicuous. Had he heard of Miss Carver's confession and chosen to stay away? As Miss Marple gathered her things, Mrs. Bantry approached, her face pale. "Miss Marple, do you think Evelyn's telling the truth about Mr. Trent and her father?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that she has told us part of the truth, but not all of it. Fear can make people hold back, even when they wish to unburden themselves. We must be patient, Mrs. Bantry, for the rest will come in time." Stepping into the cool afternoon air, Miss Marple made her way to Clover Cottage, where Constable Harris still stood guard. She paused by the window, her eyes drawn to the smudge she had noticed earlier. It was faint, barely visible in the daylight, but it suggested a hand pressed against the glass, perhaps someone peering in or out. The locked room remained a puzzle, but Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the answer lay not in the mechanics of entry, but in the timing of the crime. Her thoughts turned to the scone, the brandy, and the vial of cyanide. The scone, partially eaten, had been dismissed as irrelevant, but Miss Marple was not so sure. She recalled Mrs. Bantry's tray of scones, identical to the one from which Mr. Trent had taken his, and the way Mr. Poole's missing notebook. All were threads, and the tapestry was nearly complete. She would need to speak with Mr. Greaves again, and perhaps Mr. Poole, whose charm masked a purpose she could not yet discern. For now, she would trust in the quiet power of her little gray cells, certain that the truth was within her grasp. Chapter 9. The Trap. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, its fading light casting long shadows across Clover Lane. The village, though outwardly calm, pulsed with the tension of a mystery that had gripped its residents. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a familiar weight on her arm, walked toward Mrs. Bantry's tea room with a sense of purpose. Miss Evelyn Carver's emotional confession had shifted the investigation, revealing a connection between Mr. Julian Trent's inquiries and a past crime. But the truth remained elusive. Today, Miss Marple intended to set a trap, not with force, but with the subtle pressure of observation and suggestion, a method she had perfected over years of unraveling human secrets. The tea shop was crowded, its tables filled with villagers, drawn by the allure of gossip and the hope of news. Mrs. Clara Henshaw and Mrs. Lucy Dane sat in their usual corner, their voices low but animated. Mr. Lionel Greaves had returned, his florid waistcoat a stark contrast to his strained expression, and he was engaged in a heated discussion with Dr. Richard Hayworth, whose calm demeanor seemed to mask an inner turmoil. Mr. Arthur Poole, the traveling salesman, stood at the counter, his sharp eyes scanning the room as he chatted with Mrs. Bantry. Miss Carver was present, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly, her gaze fixed on the table as if willing herself invisible. Miss Marple took her seat by the window, her knitting needles emerging with their steady click. She had decided to share a carefully chosen piece of information, one that might provoke a reaction and reveal the hidden connections in this web of deceit. As Inspector Craddock entered, his notebook in hand and his expression weary, she beckoned him over, her voice soft but deliberate. "Inspector," she said, "I have been thinking about the letter found at Clover Cottage, the one signed C. It occurs to me that it might be connected to a matter Mr. Trent was investigating, perhaps something to do with Miss Carver's father or Mr. Greaves's legal work in London. Have you considered speaking to everyone together? A gathering, perhaps, to clarify their stories? Craddock's eyes narrowed, but he nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her suggestion. A good idea, Miss Marple. I'll arrange it for this evening, here at the tea shop. If someone's hiding something, a group setting might shake it loose. Miss Marple smiled, her needles moving steadily. Quite so, Inspector. People often reveal themselves when they feel the eyes of others upon them. As Craddock moved to make arrangements with Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple observed the room. Her mention of the letter had not gone unnoticed. Mrs. Henshaw's conversation faltered, and Mr. Greaves's hand tightened around his teacup. Miss Carver's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear, while Mr. Poole's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Dr. Hayworth, meanwhile, remained impassive, though his fingers ceased their restless drumming. The trap, Miss Marple thought, was set. Now she would watch to see who stumbled into it. The evening gathering was arranged for 7 o'clock, the same hour as the mysterious meeting suggested by the note in Miss Marple's pocket. Mrs. Bantry closed the tea shop to the public, and the suspects assembled around a large table, their faces a study in unease. Inspector Craddock stood at the head, his notebook open, while Constable Harris guarded the door. Miss Marple sat quietly to one side, her knitting a steady presence, her eyes missing nothing. Craddock began with a summary of the case, his voice clear and authoritative. Mr. Julian Trent was poisoned with cyanide in a locked room at Clover Cottage. A vial was found in the fireplace. A glass of brandy bore traces of the poison, and a letter, signed C, spoke of an old debt. We know Mr. Trent was asking questions about a past case, possibly a missing will or a suspicious death. I'd like each of you to account for your movements on the evening of his death, starting at 6 o'clock. Mrs. Henshaw spoke first, her voice sharp with indignation. I was at the vicarage, preparing for the church bazaar. I saw Mr. Greaves near Clover Lane around 7, as I told you, but I was home by past. Mr. Greaves bristled, his face reddening. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I was at home, reading. Mrs. Henshaw's mistaken. I had no reason to be near Clover Cottage. Mrs. Dane, her voice calm but firm, confirmed she had seen Mr. Trent leave the tea shop at 6. He seemed agitated, but I didn't speak to him. I was home by 7, marking papers. Dr. Hayworth, his tone measured, said he was at the surgery until 8, a fact his nurse could verify. I never saw Mr. Trent after he left the tea shop, he added, though his eyes flicked toward Miss Carver. Miss Carver's voice trembled as she spoke. I left the tea shop just after Mr. Trent. I went for a walk, as I told you, and saw him arguing with someone near Clover Cottage. I was home by 7, alone. Mr. Poole, his smile unwavering, claimed he had arrived in St. Mary Mead the following morning. I wasn't even here when it happened, he said, his hands spread in a gesture of innocence. I'm just a salesman passing through. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she listened, her mind cataloging the alibis. The contradictions were subtle but present. Mr. Greaves' denial of being near Clover Lane, Miss Carver's vague account of the argument, Mr. Poole's convenient absence. She decided to apply a gentle nudge, her voice soft but clear. It is curious. Carver gasped, her hands flying to her mouth while Mr. Greaves's face darkened with anger. Mrs. Henshaw's eyes widened, and Mrs. Dane shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Dr. Hayworth remained still, but his jaw tightened, and Mr. Poole's smile faltered, his fingers tapping the table. The air was thick with tension, and Miss Marple knew she had struck a nerve. Craddock seized the moment, his voice sharp.
If anyone knows about this letter or the notebook, now is the time to speak. Hiding the truth will only make things worse.
Miss Carver's composure broke again, and she stood, her voice trembling. I didn't write the letter, I swear, but Mr. Trent, he showed me a photograph that evening before he left the tea shop. It was of my father, taken years ago in London, with another man. He said it was proof of something terrible, but he wouldn't tell me what. I was too frightened to ask more. Craddock's eyes narrowed.
A photograph? Where is it now?
I don't know, Miss Carver said, tears streaming down her face. He took it with him. I never saw it again. Miss Marple's mind raced. A photograph, a missing notebook, a letter signed C. The pieces were falling into place, but the pattern was not yet complete. She noted the reactions around the table. Mr. Greaves's clenched fists, Mrs. Henshaw's sudden silence, Mr. Poole's forced calm. Someone in this room, she was certain, knew more than they were saying. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting a quiet rhythm in the now silent tea shop. The trap had been sprung, and the truth was closer than ever. She would need to examine the cottage again, she decided, and perhaps speak with Mr. Poole, whose polished exterior was beginning to crack. For now, she would trust in her little gray cells, confident that the final revelation was within reach. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The evening air in St. Mary Mead was heavy with the scent of autumn leaves, and Mrs. Bantry's tea room, though closed to the public, glowed with the soft light of lamps as the suspects gathered once more. Miss Jane Marple had orchestrated this final assembly, her quiet suggestion to Inspector Craddock carrying the weight of her unerring instinct. The tea shop, with its lace curtains and polished oak tables, was a fitting stage for the denouement of a mystery that had gripped the village. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles silent for once, her eyes bright with the clarity of a puzzle solved. Inspector Craddock stood at the head of the table, his notebook open, his demeanor one of controlled anticipation. Around him sat Mrs. Clara Henshaw, Mrs. Lucy Dane, Mr. Lionel Greaves, Dr. Richard Hayworth, Miss Evelyn Carver, and Mr. Arthur Poole, each face a mask of apprehension or defiance. Constable Harris stood by the door, his youthful earnestness tempered by the gravity of the moment. Miss Marple, though not the official investigator, was the quiet force behind the gathering, her little gray cells having woven the threads of the mystery into a coherent tapestry.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Craddock began, his voice steady.
We are here to resolve the matter of Mr. Julian Trent's murder. Thanks to Miss Marple's keen insight, we have uncovered the truth behind this perplexing crime. I ask you to listen carefully, for the solution is as intricate as it is inevitable.
Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene but watchful.
If I may, Inspector,
She said softly.
I should like to explain how the pieces came together. It is, after all, a matter of human nature. And human nature is rarely as opaque as it seems.
Craddock nodded, yielding the floor. Miss Marple's voice, though gentle, carried the authority of certainty.
Mr. Trent's death in a locked room at Clover Cottage was no accident, nor was it the work of chance. It was a carefully planned murder, rooted in a secret from the past, a secret he had come to St. Mary Mead to uncover. Let us begin with the clues. A vial of cyanide in the fireplace, a glass of brandy, a partially eaten scone, a missing notebook, a letter signed C, and a smudge on the window. Each, in its way, told a story.
She paused, her eyes sweeping the table.
Mr. Trent was a man of purpose, investigating a matter from years ago, a disputed will connected to a death that was not what it seemed. The letter found at Clover Cottage, signed C, spoke of an old debt and a truth that must stay buried. This letter, I believe, was written by Miss Evelyn Carver's father, Charles Carver, long thought to have died in an accident in London.
Miss Carver gasped, her hands trembling. But Miss Marple continued, her voice calm.
Miss Carver, you told us Mr. Trent showed you a photograph of your father with another man, suggesting foul play in his death. I suspect that man was Mr. Lionel Greaves, who, as a solicitor in London, handled a will that caused a scandal. Mr. Trent believed Mr. Greaves had manipulated that will, perhaps to cheat your father out of an inheritance, leading to his untimely death.
Mr. Greaves' face reddened, his fists clenching.
That's preposterous,
He sputtered.
I had no dealings with Trent beyond a few questions.
Miss Marple's eyes twinkled.
But you were seen near Clover Cottage at 7 o'clock, Mr. Greaves, despite your claim of being at home. Mrs. Henshaw's testimony places you there, and I believe you met Mr. Trent to confront him about his inquiries. You feared he would expose your past misdeeds, did you not?
Greaves opened his mouth to protest, but Miss Marple raised a hand.
Let us consider the locked room. The door was locked. The key in Mr. Trent's
Thin blade, perhaps, slipped through a crack to lift the latch, allowing entry and exit without disturbing the lock. The room was silent, all eyes fixed on Miss Marple. But the poison, she continued, was not in the brandy as we first assumed. The vial in the fireplace was a distraction, meant to mislead. The cyanide was in the scone Mr. Trent took from this very tea shop. It was laced with poison before he left, a subtle act that required access to the tray and knowledge of his habits. Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My scones, but how? Miss Marple's gaze turned to Mr. Arthur Poole, whose smile had vanished, replaced by a wary stillness. Mr. Poole, she said, you arrived in St. Mary Mead the morning after the murder, claiming to be a traveling salesman. Yet your knowledge of stationery and notebooks caught my attention. Mr. Trent's notebook, so carefully guarded, was missing, and I believe you took it, for it contained evidence of the truth he sought. You were no stranger to Mr. Trent, were you? You were his associate, sent to retrieve the notebook and ensure his silence. Poole's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Miss Marple pressed on. You poisoned the scone, knowing Mr. Trent would take it to Clover Cottage. You waited until he was alone, then used a tool to open the window, entering to retrieve the notebook and stage the scene with the brandy and vial. The smudge on the window betrayed your method, and your arrival in the village was no coincidence. Craddock stepped forward, his voice sharp. Mr. Poole, do you deny this? Poole's composure cracked, his hands trembling. You have no proof, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple's smile was gentle but unrelenting. The proof lies in the details, Mr. Poole. The notebook, I suspect, is still in your possession, hidden among your stationery samples. And the photograph Miss Carver mentioned. It was in the notebook, was it not? A photograph linking Mr. Greaves to her father's death. A truth you were hired to suppress. Miss Carver sobbed, her voice breaking. It's true. The photograph showed my father with Mr. Greaves, and Mr. Trent said it proved he was cheated. I didn't know what to do. Craddock signaled to Constable Harris, who moved to stand behind Poole. We'll search your belongings, Mr. Poole, Craddock said. If the notebook is there, you'll have some explaining to do. Poole's shoulders slumped, and he buried his face in his hands, the weight of his guilt evident. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. It is always the small things, she said almost to herself. A smudge, a scone, a note. They tell the story, if one listens. The room was silent, the suspect stunned by the revelation. Gathered her things, her work done. The mystery of Mr. Trent's death had been solved, not through force or chance, but through the quiet logic of her little gray cells. As she stepped into the night, the stars above St. Mary Mead twinkling in the crisp air, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The truth had been revealed, and justice would follow. For now, she would return to her cottage, her knitting, and the simple pleasures of village life, ready for the next puzzle that fate might bring. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, casting a soft glow across the dew-kissed cobblestones of Clover Lane. The village, though still reeling from the dramatic revelation of Mr. Julian Trent's murder, seemed to exhale, as if the uncovering of the truth had lifted a weight from its collective heart. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage by the fire, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, her mind turning over the events of the previous evening. The tea-shop gathering had been a triumph of logic and observation. But for Miss Marple, the true satisfaction lay not in the drama of the reveal, but in the quiet reflection that followed. She sipped her tea, her eyes resting on the garden beyond her window, where the last of the autumn roses clung to their stems. The case of Mr. Trent's murder had been a puzzle of exquisite complexity, woven from the threads of human greed, fear, and deception. Mr. Arthur Poole, now in custody, had confessed to poisoning the scone and staging the locked room scene, driven by a desperate need to protect a secret from Mr. Trent's investigations. The notebook, recovered from Poole's belongings, contained the photograph of Miss Carver's father and Mr. Greaves, along with notes detailing a fraudulent will that had robbed Charles Carver of his inheritance, a motive that had led to his suspicious death years ago in London. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the letter signed C, which Inspector Craddock had confirmed was indeed written by Charles Carver, sent to Mr. Trent before his death as a plea for justice. The old debt was not financial, but moral. A demand for the truth about his demise to be uncovered. Mr. Trent, a private investigator hired by a distant relative of the Carver family, had come to St. Mary Mead to confront Mr. Greaves, whose legal manipulations had set the tragedy in motion. Poole, employed by an unknown party with ties to the original fraud, had been dispatched to silence Trent before the truth could surface. The smudge on the window, Miss Marple mused, had been the key that unlocked the mystery. It was not, as she had first thought, a handprint, but the mark of a thin metal tool used to lift the window's bolt, a trick Poole had learned in his less reputable dealings. The scone, into believing the poison had been administered later in the locked room. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her mind drifting to the people of St. Mary Mead. Miss Evelyn Carver, though shaken, had found a measure of peace in knowing her father's death was not an accident, but a crime that would now be investigated further. Mr. Greaves, though not the murderer, faced scrutiny for his past actions, his bluster replaced by a quiet shame. Mrs. Clara Henshaw and Mrs. Lucy Dane, whose gossip had provided valuable threads, would no doubt continue their chatter, but with a newfound respect for the dangers of secrets. Dr. Richard Hayworth, whose reserved demeanor had masked only a professional concern, would return to his duties, perhaps with a greater appreciation for the village's complexities. As for Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple thought with a smile, she would recover her tea-shop's warmth, though she might never look at her scones quite the same way. The tea-shop itself, a microcosm of St. Mary Mead's heart, had been the stage for this drama, its tables and teacups silent witnesses to the unfolding truth. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. It was Inspector Craddock, his face weary but relieved, his notebook tucked under his arm. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside, "I wanted to thank you. Without your insight, we'd still be chasing shadows." Poole's confessed everything, how he poisoned the scone, how he used a tool to open the window, even how he was hired by a London solicitor to retrieve Trent's notebook. "We're looking into that solicitor now, thanks to you." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she offered him a chair. "You are too kind, Inspector. I merely noticed what was there to be seen. People, you know, are not so different from my knitting patterns. They follow a design, and when a stitch is dropped, it shows. If one knows where to look. Craddock smiled, a rare warmth in his expression. You have a gift, Miss Marple. I'll admit, I thought the locked room was an impossible puzzle. But you saw through it. The scone, the window, the notebook. How do you do it? Miss Marple's needles resumed their click, a soothing counterpoint to her words. It is simply a matter of understanding people, Inspector. They act according to their nature, and their nature betrays them. Mr. Trent was a man seeking justice. Mr. Poole, a man driven by fear. Mr. Greaves, a man hiding from his past. Each left a trace, a small inconsistency that told the story. In a village like St. Mary Mead, where everyone knows everyone else, those traces are all the clearer. Craddock nodded, his respect evident. And Miss Carver? She's been through a lot. Indeed, got the gratitude of the entire force. If we ever face another puzzle like this, I'll know where to turn. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes warm. You are most welcome, Inspector. But I trust St. Mary Mead will have a rest from such excitement for a while. As Craddock departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts drifting to the philosophy that guided her. Life, she reflected, was a tapestry of human actions, each thread revealing a truth if one looked closely enough. The murder of Mr. Trent had been a dark thread, but it had been woven into the fabric of justice, thanks to the quiet work of her little gray cells. She rose, her knitting set aside, and stepped into her garden where the roses glowed in the morning light. St. Mary Mead was peaceful once more, its secrets laid bare, its harmony restored. Miss Marple breathed in the crisp air, her heart light. There would be other puzzles, other threads to unravel, but for now, she was content to let the village settle into its familiar rhythm, knowing that she was ready for whatever mysteries might come next. Chapter 12. A Quiet Return to Clover Lane. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Mrs. Bantry's tea room, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak tables. St. Mary Mead, though shaken by the recent unmasking of Mr. Arthur Poole as Mr. Julian Trent's murderer, was beginning to reclaim its quiet charm. The tea shop, once a stage for whispered suspicions and veiled secrets, hummed with a cautious return to normalcy. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag at her side, took her usual seat by the window, her presence a quiet reassurance to the villagers who had come to rely on her unerring insight. The tea shop was moderately busy, its patrons a mix of familiar faces and curious newcomers, drawn by the village's recent notoriety. Mrs. Clara Henshaw and Mrs. Lucy Dane sat in their customary corner, their conversation more subdued than usual, as if the weight of recent events lingered in their words. Dr. Richard Hayworth was present, his medical journal open but unread, his expression one of quiet contemplation. Mr. Lionel Greaves, though still under scrutiny for his past misdeeds, had returned, his florid waistcoat a defiant splash of color, though his bluster was notably tempered. Miss Evelyn Carver, pale but composed, sat alone, her hands steady for the first time in days, a sign that the truth about her father's death had begun to ease her burden. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a familiar rhythm that grounded her thoughts as she observed the room. The resolution of Mr. Trent's murder had brought clarity, but it had also left ripples, small disturbances in the fabric of St. Mary Mead that would take time to settle. The notebook, recovered from Mr. Poole's possession, Greaves was not the murderer. His actions had set the chain of events in motion, and he now faced the prospect of legal consequences in London. Mrs. Bantry approached Miss Marple's table, her face a mixture of relief and lingering unease. "Miss Marple," she said, setting down a fresh pot of tea, "I don't know how you did it. To think it was one of my scones, poisoned, no less. I'll never look at my baking the same way." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "My dear Mrs. Bantry, your scones are as delightful as ever. It was not the scone itself, but the hands that tampered with it. You mustn't let this trouble you. The tea shop is the heart of our village, and it will beat strongly again." Mrs. Bantry nodded, her expression softening. "You're right, of course. But I'm glad you are here, Miss Marple. Without you, we might never have known the truth." As Mrs. Bantry returned to the counter, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the details of the case. The smudge on the window, the cyanide lace scone, the letters signed C, each had played its part in unraveling the mystery. Mr. Poole's confession had confirmed her deductions. He had been hired by a shadowy figure in London, likely connected to the original fraud, to retrieve Mr. Trent's notebook and silence his inquiries. The locked room, a puzzle that had baffled Inspector Craddock, was no mystery at all once the window's manipulation was understood, a simple trick executed with precision. Her reverie was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Carver, who approached her table with hesitant steps. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I wanted to thank you. Knowing the truth about my father, it's painful, but it's given me a sense of purpose. I'm going to London to see if I can reclaim what was taken from him." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes warm with understanding. "You are very brave, my dear. The truth can be a heavy burden, but it also sets us free. You must take care and know that you have friends here in St. Mary Mead." Miss Carver nodded, a small smile breaking through her pallor. "I will. Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything." As Miss Carver returned to her table, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Mr. Greaves, who was speaking quietly with Dr. Hayworth. The solicitor's shoulders were slumped, his usual bravado replaced by a quiet resignation. Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy, for while Greaves's actions had been wrong, they were born of greed rather than malice. He would face justice, but she hoped he might find redemption as well. The bell above the door chimed, and Inspector Craddock entered, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. He approached Miss Marple's table, his notebook tucked under his arm. "Miss Marple," he said, sitting opposite her, "I've just come from the station. Poole's been formally charged, and we've sent the notebook and photograph to the authorities in London. They're reopening the case of Charles Carver's death, thanks to your work." Miss Marple inclined her head, her needles resuming their rhythm.
"You give me too much credit, Inspector. I merely pointed out what was there to be seen. The rest was your diligence and the courage of those who spoke the truth."
Craddock smiled, a rare warmth in his eyes. "You're too modest, Miss Marple. But I've learned my lesson. I'll never underestimate those little gray cells of yours again." Miss Marple's laugh was soft, almost musical.
"You are kind, Inspector. But I find that people are much like my knitting. A pattern emerges if one is patient and attentive. St. Mary Mead is full of such patterns, and I am merely an observer of them."
Craddock rose, his expression thoughtful. "Well, I hope the village stays quiet for a while. You've earned a rest, Miss Marple." As he departed, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to the window. Clover Lane stretched before her, its cottages and hedgerows a picture of tranquility. Yet she knew that beneath the surface, the village was alive with stories, small dramas of love, loss, and ambition that might one day require her attention. For now, though, she was content to let the tea shop reclaim its role as a place of warmth and community. The afternoon waned, and the tea shop began to empty, its patrons dispersing into the gathering dusk. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her heart light with the knowledge that justice had been served. She stepped into the cool air, her steps unhurried, her mind already turning to the simple pleasures of her garden and her next project. St. Mary Mead was at peace, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and relentless curiosity, was ready for whatever mysteries the future might bring. Chapter 13. The Echoes of Truth. The late morning sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a gentle glow, its rays filtering through the bare branches of the trees along Clover Lane. The village, though settling back into its familiar rhythm, carried a subtle undercurrent of change, as if the revelation of Mr. Julian Trent's murder had left an indelible mark on its heart. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, walked toward Mrs. Bantry's tea room. Her steps measured but purposeful. The case was solved, the culprit apprehended, yet she sensed that the echoes of the truth would linger, stirring ripples that demanded her attention. The tea expression calm but resolute, a sign that she was beginning to find strength in the truth about her father's death. Mr. Arthur Poole, now in custody, was notably absent, his shadow lingering only in the memories of those who had witnessed his unmasking. Miss Marple took her seat by the window, her knitting needles emerging with their familiar click. She observed the room with her usual acuity, noting the subtle shifts in demeanor among the patrons. The tea shop, once a stage for secrets and suspicions, was slowly reclaiming its role as a place of community. But the memory of the poisoned scone and the locked room at Clover Cottage was still fresh. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the broader implications of the case, for the truth about Mr. Trent's murder had uncovered a deeper scandal, one that reached beyond St. Mary Mead to the legal circles of London. As she sipped her tea, Mrs. Bantry approached, her face a mixture of relief and curiosity. "Miss Marple," she said, setting down a plate of scones with a cautious glance, "I've had a letter from the vicar. He's heard from the authorities in London. They're investigating that old will Mr. Greaves handled. It seems Mr. Trent's notebook has stirred up quite a hornet's nest. Do you think there'll be more trouble?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Trouble, my dear Mrs. Bantry, is often the shadow cast by truth. The investigation in London will follow its course, and those who wronged Miss Carver's father will face their reckoning. As for St. Mary Mead, I believe we shall have peace for a time, though one never knows what secrets lie beneath the surface." Mrs. Bantry nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've a way of seeing things, Miss Marple. I don't know how you do it, but I'm grateful. The tea shop feels safer now, thanks to you." Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, a soothing counterpoint to her words. "It is merely a matter of listening, Mrs. Bantry. People reveal themselves in the smallest ways, a glance, a word, a hesitation. The tea shop is a mirror of the village, and I am fortunate to have a seat by the window." As Mrs. Bantry returned to the counter, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Mr. Greaves, who was speaking quietly with Mrs. Henshaw. His usual bluster was gone, replaced by a quiet resignation that suggested he was preparing for the consequences of his past actions. Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy, for while Greaves's greed had set the tragedy in motion, he was not the murderer. His role, though culpable, was one of cowardice rather than malice, and she hoped he might find a path to atonement. Arrest of a solicitor named Mr. Clarence Vane. Seems he was the one who hired Poole to silence Trent. It's a tangled mess, but your work here set it all in motion. Miss Marple inclined her head, her needles pausing briefly. "I am glad to hear it, Inspector. Mr. Trent was a man seeking justice, and though he paid a heavy price, his efforts were not in vain. Miss Carver, I trust, will find some measure of closure." Craddock nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "She's leaving for London tomorrow to meet with the authorities. She's determined to see her father's case through. I'd say she's stronger than she looks, thanks to you." Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "She is young, Inspector, and youth has a resilience that surprises us. As for my part, I merely pointed out the threads. You and your men wove them together." Craddock chuckled, a rare sound. "You're too modest, Miss Marple. But I've learned my lesson. I'll be keeping an eye on Clover Lane, and on you for any future mysteries." Miss Marple's laugh was soft, almost musical. "I hope, Inspector, that St. Mary Mead will grant us a respite, but should another puzzle arise, I shall be here with my knitting and my little gray cells." As Craddock departed, Miss Marple's gaze returned to the tea shop, where the villagers were beginning to relax, their conversations lighter, their smiles more genuine. She noted the absence of fear in Miss Carver's posture, the quiet dignity in Dr. Hayworth's demeanor, the cautious optimism in Mrs. Dane's voice. The village was healing, she thought, its wounds soothed by the truth, however painful. The afternoon waned, and Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her heart light with the knowledge that order had been restored. She stepped into the crisp air of Clover Lane, her eyes lingering on the cottages and hedgerows that defined her world. St. Mary Mead was a place of simple beauty, but also of hidden depths, where the smallest details could unravel the greatest secrets. For now, she would return to her cottage, her garden, and the quiet pleasures of her life, ready for whatever mysteries might lie ahead. Chapter 14. The Village Settles. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over St. Mary Mead, its light softening the edges of Clover Lane and bathing the village in a serene glow. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, a reminder that autumn was yielding to winter. Mrs. Bantry's tea room, the heart of the village's daily rhythm, hummed with a cautious optimism, as if their corner, their conversation lively, but tinged with a newfound caution, as if they were wary of stirring old wounds. Dr. Richard Hayworth was present, his medical journal open, though his attention seemed drawn to the chatter around him. Mr. Lionel Greaves, though subdued, had returned, his florid waistcoat a muted declaration of his presence. Miss Evelyn Carver was absent, having departed for London to pursue her father's case, a fact that filled Miss Marple with quiet pride. The absence of Mr. Arthur Poole, now awaiting trial, was a silent testament to the justice that had been served. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm that anchored her thoughts. The case of Mr. Trent's murder had been a complex tapestry, woven from threads of greed, deception, and long-buried secrets. The notebook, the poisoned scone, the smudge on the window, and the letter signed C had all played their part, revealing a truth that stretched from St. Mary Mead to the legal circles of London. Mr. Poole's confession had confirmed Miss Marple's deductions, and the arrest of Mr. Clarence Vane, the solicitor who had hired him, promised further revelations in the days to come. As she sipped her tea, Mrs. Bantry approached, her face alight with a mix of relief and curiosity. "Miss Marple," she said, setting down a fresh scone with a cautious smile. "I've had a letter from Miss Carver. She's settled in London, meeting with lawyers about her father's estate. She says she owes it all to you, says you gave her the courage to face the truth." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she set her knitting aside. "Dear Miss Carver is too kind, Mrs. Bantry. She had the strength within her all along. I merely helped her see it. The truth, though painful, has a way of setting things right." Mrs. Bantry nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've a gift, Miss Marple. To think it all started here, in my tea shop, with a poisoned scone. I've checked every batch twice since, you know." Miss Marple's laugh was soft, almost musical. "And rightly so, my dear. But your tea shop remains a place of warmth and community, and no shadow can dim that for long." As Mrs. Bantry returned to the counter, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the other patrons. Mrs. Henshaw and Mrs. Dane were discussing the upcoming church bazaar, their voices lighter than they had been in days. Dr. Hayworth, catching her eye, offered a nod of respect, a silent acknowledgement of her role in restoring the village's peace. Mr. Greaves, though still under scrutiny, seemed quieter, his usual bluster replaced by a reflective air. Miss Marple noted the change with approval. Sometimes, she thought, the weight of one's actions could lead to growth. "The London police have uncovered more about Mr. Vane. He was part of a ring of solicitors who manipulated wills during the war. Mr. Trent's notebook has led to 3 more arrests. The inspector says you're to be commended." Miss Marple inclined her head, her needles resuming their rhythm. "That is good news, Constable. But I only pointed out what was there to be seen. The credit belongs to the inspector and his men, and to Mr. Trent, who sought justice at such a cost." Harris nodded, his admiration evident. "All the same, ma'am, the inspector says he's never seen a case solved like this. He's calling it the tea shop mystery down at the station." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes warm. "A fitting name, perhaps, but I suspect St. Mary Mead will prefer to call it a memory soon enough." As Harris departed, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the village itself. St. Mary Mead was a place of simple beauty, its cottages and lanes a canvas for the dramas of human life. The murder of Mr. Trent had been a dark chapter, but it had also revealed the resilience of the community. The tea shop, with its steaming teapots and clinking cups, was a testament to that resilience, a place where secrets were shared and truths uncovered. The afternoon wore on, and the tea shop began to empty, its patrons drifting back to their homes. Miss Marple lingered, her knitting nearly complete, her mind at ease. She thought of the smudge on the window, a detail so small yet so pivotal, and the letter signed C, which had carried the weight of a father's plea. Each clue had been a thread, and together they had formed a tapestry of justice. As she gathered her things and stepped into the cool air of Clover Lane, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The village was healing, its harmony restored, and she was content to return to her cottage, her garden, and the gentle rhythm of her days. St. Mary Mead would always have its secrets, she knew, but it would also have her, ready to unravel them with the quiet power of her little gray cells. Chapter 15. The Quiet Exit. The twilight of St. Mary Mead draped Clover Lane in a gentle hush, the village settling into the calm of an autumn evening. The air was crisp, carrying the faint perfume of chrysanthemums and the distant murmur of the church bell marking the hour. Mrs. Bantry's tea room, its windows glowing softly, stood as a beacon of warmth, its role as the heart of the village reaffirmed in the wake of Mr. Julian Trent's murder. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, made her way to the tea shop for what she sensed would be her final visit in this particular chapter of St. Mary Mead's story. The tea shop was quieter than usual. its tables sparsely occupied as the villagers eased back into their routines. Mrs. Clara Henshaw and Mrs. Luce counter, his medical journal open, a faint smile playing on his lips as he exchanged a word with Mrs. Bantry. Mr. Lionel Greaves was present, his florid waistcoat subdued by the weight of impending legal scrutiny, his demeanor one of quiet introspection. Miss Evelyn Carver, now in London pursuing justice for her father, was a felt absence, her courage a lingering inspiration. Miss Marple took her seat by the window, her knitting needles emerging with their familiar click, a rhythm that had accompanied her through the unraveling of the mystery. The case of Mr. Trent's murder had been a tapestry of human frailties, greed, fear, and the desperate need to bury the past. The poisoned scone, the smudge on the window, the letter signed C, and the missing notebook had each played their part, guiding her to the truth with the precision of her little gray cells. Mr. Arthur Poole's confession and the arrest of Mr. Clarence Vane in London had closed the circle, ensuring that justice would ripple beyond the confines of St. Mary Mead. As she sipped her tea, Mrs. Bantry approached, her face alight with gratitude. "Miss Marple," she said, setting down a plate of scones with a newfound confidence, "I've had word from Miss Carver. She's making progress in London. Says the lawyers are hopeful about her father's case. She asked me to thank you again for giving her the strength to go on." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she set her knitting aside. "Miss Carver is a brave young woman, Mrs. Bantry. I merely helped her see what was already within her. The tea shop, I think, played its own role. A place where truths are shared over tea and scones." Mrs. Bantry laughed, a sound of relief. "You're right, as always. I've even started baking again, though I check every ingredient twice now. You've made this place feel like home again, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "A village is made of its people, my dear, and St. Mary Mead is fortunate to have you at its heart." As Mrs. Bantry returned to the counter, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Mr. Greaves, who sat alone, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the table. She felt a quiet sympathy for him, for while his actions years ago had set this tragedy in motion, he was not the murderer. His reckoning would come, but she hoped it might lead to redemption rather than ruin. Dr. Hayworth, catching her eye, offered a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the village's debt to her quiet wisdom. The bell above the door chimed, and Inspector Craddock entered, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. He approached Miss Marple's table, his notebook tucked away, a rare sign of a case concluded. "Miss Marple," he said, sitting opposite her, "I've just had a telegram from London. Mr. Vane's accomplices have been identified, and the case against them is solid, thanks to Trent's notebook. You've done more than solve a murder. You've righted a wrong that's been
Buried for years."
Miss Marple inclined her head, her needles resuming their rhythm.
I am glad, Inspector. Mr. Trent's quest for justice was a noble one, and though he paid a heavy price, his work lives on. As for me, I only followed the threads that were there to be seen."
Craddock's smile was warm, a rare break in his professional demeanor.
You make it sound simple, Miss Marple, but I know better. St. Mary Mead is lucky to have you, and so am I. If another mystery crops up, I'll know where to find you.
Miss Marple's laugh was soft, almost a whisper.
Let us hope, Inspector, that the village enjoys a season of peace. But should the need arise, I shall be here, with my knitting and my observations.
As Craddock rose to leave, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the philosophy that had guided her through this case. Life in St. Mary Mead, like her knitting, was a pattern of small details, gestures, words, glances, that revealed the truth when carefully observed. The tea shop, with its clinking teacups and murmured conversations, was a microcosm of that life, a place where secrets surfaced and justice found its way. The evening deepened and the tea shop began to empty, its patrons drifting into the night with farewells that carried a renewed sense of community. Miss Marple lingered, her knitting nearly complete, a delicate shawl that mirrored the intricacy of the mystery she had solved. She thought of the smudge on the window, the poisoned scone, the letter that had carried a father's plea across years. Each had been a thread, and together they had woven a tapestry of truth. Rising from her seat, Miss Marple gathered her things, her heart light with the knowledge that St. Mary Mead was at peace once more. She stepped into the cool evening air, the stars above Clover Lane twinkling like the clues she had followed. The village was quiet, its secrets laid bare, its harmony restored. With a final glance at the tea shop's glowing windows, Miss Marple made her way home, her steps unhurried, her mind at ease. The mystery of the tea shop was solved, and she was ready for whatever puzzles the future might bring, her little gray cells ever vigilant in the service of truth. Miss Marple Dial